Hi, everybody. This is the Right Launch Group, and today our special lesson, which we are going to record for everyone too, is Alex Sanfilippo. Did I pronounce that correctly, Alex?
You did, which is extremely rare. Thanks, Timothy.
Just try to pronounce my last name. See if you get it right.
Uh, I didn't write it down, but Gagger,
Gager.
Gager. Wait, is
No
there a
one gets
U?
no one gets it right. But anyway, enough
Okay,
about this. So Alex is going to talk to us and teach us about everything podcast, how to be a guest, how to run one successfully, how to make money on them, how to promote through them. So how about we have Alex take it away a little bit, and then we'll open up for some questions.
cool. I'm really excited to be here. The New Right Launch Group. I've heard nothing but great things about this. So, Timothy, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. Really, really means a lot, man. Thank you. If anyone has questions along the way, just either use the reactions or raise your hand if you're on screen. One thing I don't like in this type of thing is if you have a question 3 minutes in and you wait 45 minutes to ask it. So I don't want to get into any of that. And with that said, Timothy, how long do you want me to talk for, so I make sure that I keep this in sync the way you want it
You
to?
can you can talk up to an hour or 2 o'clock Eastern time, but whenever it winds down, it winds down. I mean,
Cool.
that's great. Whatever you have prepared is just a bonus for us.
Great, cool. No, I love that. It's exciting. I'll be sharing for the next 4.5 hours, everybody. So get ready.
Woo!
Yeah, I'm just kidding. But again, if you do have questions on the way, let's have some dialogue, because I find that I skip things. Like anything, once we get into it, we tend to think everyone knows what we know, and that's just not the case. So slow me down so we can make it valuable for people also checking out the recording. So I'll talk about podcasting on either side of my guest host and how to succeed on either side of the mic. But first, I'm just going to talk about the podcasting industry for a minute, because I think it's important to get the context of where it's at as a medium. The first thing is I'm just going to go straight into the actual data of it. There are technically millions of podcasts, but not that are active. And that's a really important thing, because I had some the other day. I don't know where they got this data from, but they're like, there's 7 million podcasts, so why would I even try? There's never been that many. I always define a podcast by if it's on Apple or not, which I'm starting to hear maybe that's not the best metric, because some people don't like their podcast to be on Apple. But anyway, Apple actively removes podcasts that are inactive or aren't posting anything. As long as if there's something valuable on it, they'll keep it. But example, if someone just uploaded an episode where they said test, does this work? And like, I'll upload more later, those end up getting removed and deleted. So again, I like the baseline of using Apple as kind of the deciding factor. So I'm gonna, so I don't misspeak numbers, I will drop a link to this as well for later. If it's on my website, I'm not here to promote my website. There's no information login or requirement to get this, but it's podpros.com. And then if you click in the top right in the navigation, you'll actually see like a little dial that shows total podcasters, and that report is what I'll kind of gauge these numbers off of. So right now, and this is a few days old, this is this month, a few days old, and it's always changing, but there's just under 2.9 million podcasts. Active, there's just under 400,000 active podcasts. So there's a bit of a difference there, right? So we're looking at, again, nearly, let's just say close to 3 million, but only 400,000 are actually active. And that comes out to be about 13.6% of the entire, of all of them. The next thing I want to look at, though, is not just active. It's like, what does that mean for independent podcasters that are actively podcasting? There's only about 120,000 of those that actually are getting some traction, that are starting to move. And out of those podcasts that are starting to get some traction, that have some episodes and are making waves, there's only about 37,000 that are actually having influence because they've released enough episodes. So here's the thing. I call this section of, and this is all in that report, but making it as a podcaster. And this is kind of your chances. Making it to 8 episodes, you have about a 45% chance. Making it to 50 episodes, which I consider 1 year, if you do 1 episode a week, you have about 11% chance. Making it to 100 episodes, which is where really that traction, like I was just talking about, that there's only 37,000 podcasters in that area. Traction seems to take about 100 episodes. And I don't know why, but my podcast started getting discovered by way more people. It was almost like this crazy thing, but there's no real data to show why that would happen. But so many podcasters I talk to say 100 episodes when it really breaks through. You've got just over a 6% chance of making it that far. So again, like it's it's not like there is just tons of podcasts. There's really about 37,000 that are actually making it. And the deciding factor, if you make it as a podcast guest or host, is can you stay consistent long enough to be able to kind of break that traction, which I think is anything in life, right? Consistent results, or consistency leads to results. And I found that to be true. Timothy, you had a question on this side of things?
Yeah, I've got a question. So if Apple's eliminating podcasts, say that you've appeared on that podcast, is it gone forever? Because I have a problem, not a problem, but like sometimes, I mean, I've had a lot of work published, and then when the site goes down, suddenly I don't have a lot of work published.
So it won't, because there's thousands of podcast directories. This is what I love about podcasting. There's literally, at this point, I don't even know, more than 2,000 directories of where podcasts can be listened to, how you can find them, places that go automatically. If you've done a podcast, it never goes away, which I think is a beautiful thing. And sometimes it's years later before they even start like making traction, because you might talk about something that the world's really not thinking about right now. Like, here's the thing. If I had you on my podcast, let's just use this as an example, in 2018, and you were talking about AI, nobody cared. But now I bet that podcast episode with someone talking about in 2018 is now extremely popular because people are actually interested in it. And so just because it gets removed from Apple doesn't mean it's getting removed from other places. But I've found that Apple does not really remove anything that has value. Again, it's the person saying, test, does this work? Okay, I'll upload an episode later. Those are the things that are getting removed because it is a completely manual process. And also, I think they don't even check it unless it's never had anyone listen to it. So that's kind of where I base that 2.8 million on is Apple's data. But does that answer your question, Timothy?
Yes.
Cool.
To follow up in terms of adding podcasts, do you know anything about there's like if you do like a YouTube series, YouTube, there's this button that says make it into a podcast. Will automatically make it a podcast. And I hit the button. I have no idea where that podcast is. Like, where does that one go? Do you know that one?
Yeah. I'm going to get into that in a minute because YouTube's kind of its own beast. But that's a very good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So is it all right if I circle back to that one?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll get there in a few minutes. That'll be the next thing I talk about. That's super important. I'm glad you brought that up. The other side of podcasting is the guesting side. When we did this is very broad data. And again, that report that I sent the link to, and again, podpros.com, it's in the top right corner if somebody wants to grab it. We just started tracking podcast guests as well. And so that how we got the data for everything I've mentioned is all listed at the bottom there. So if you want, I'm not going to get into the boring stuff though and tell you like, oh, this is from Edison Research based on this report on this, right? You can go find that stuff later. It's all listed there. But we decided to start tracking how many people are trying to be guests on podcast. And there's 17 people trying to be to every one podcast, trying to be a guest on it. Let's put it that way. There's about 120,000 podcasts at any given time actually looking for guests that are not the celebrity ones. So like we pulled the Joe Rogans out, the big TV network ones, like we're not going to include those in the mix. And it's probably only about 500 additional. So it's 125,000 podcasts looking for guests at any given time. And we're estimating right now there's just over 2 million people actively looking to be guests right now at any given time. And we gauge that off of seeing their name come up more than twice in 2 different podcasts in the last 6 months. So it's only people that have actually already started. There could be way more than that. But the reason that's an important metric is because podcast guesting used to be something, if you wanted to do it, you'd have hosts knocking down your door to bring you on. And now it's the opposite. Hosts are like, please go away or give me the perfect reason that you're a guest. So that's something to consider. And we'll get into that a little bit as well. But before I do that, the industry overall, like, is it healthy on either side of the mic? I look at one thing to decide this. Is listenership climbing? And like kind of a subcategory of that, is listenership time increasing? And the answer to both those is yes. Right now, podcasting is on a great trajectory to continue to grow. More and more people are listening, but also in the last 5 years, podcast listenership has doubled. And that's according to Edison Research and iHeart. Those 2 companies that said that the amount of time people spend listening went from 30 minutes to just over an hour in the last 5 years. And then again, the amount of people listening globally is climbing. So right now, I always tell people it's the best time ever to get into podcasting on either side of the mic because the influence you have through it is really increasing and growing. This is where YouTube comes up. The biggest, like, I don't know, like hot topic in podcasting right now is YouTube. And that's because YouTube, they actually just got rid of, they're about to sunset Google Podcasts, which was one of, I think, like the 3rd most popular listening app. They're taking that away and moving it into YouTube Music will be where you can actually consume podcasts for them. And they're sending a lot of data out. I don't mean to be rude by saying this, but they're very loose with what they consider a podcast. So traditionally speaking, podcast is something that's built on what the technology RSS, which is the same thing that like a blog is based on. Email is basically based on that. Like it's all kind of comes from that. If you have just something on YouTube, it's not technically a podcast. And when they released all these numbers of showing they have more listenership of podcasts than anything else, they now consider anyone with a consistent YouTube channel to be a podcaster, which is just not the definition of it, right? It'd be like me claiming I'm a professional football player because I watch it every week, right? Like it's not the same thing. So yeah, I'm basically a professional football player because I watch it every Sunday. Just not the case. So again, I don't say it to be rude or mean, but they're trying to trick people into thinking you don't need to base it off of RSS anymore because they want to really control that market, much like they control video, which I guess isn't an issue. They're just a company looking to grow, and some people have done well with podcast on there. But to give you an example of mine, I do everything right on YouTube that I know how to do. So I'm not perfect, but I even add transcriptions. I add all the notes, all the tags. The videos have subtitles that have been checked by a human. Like everything that you're supposed to do, I upload my podcast there, and it equates to 1% of my total listenership. The other 99% is audio only, and it's high quality video as well. So it's like that's my listenership is coming still from audio, and that's where we're seeing the growth happen. So again, having a YouTube channel and calling it a podcast is a great thing. I think we should all probably be doing that, but don't say I'm not going to have a traditional RSS based podcast where it goes to thousands of people and thousands of places. So keep that in mind. That's my thought on that. So anyway, I've kind of done an overview of podcasting in general. Did I miss anything that you all think would be important that you want me to cover before I get into specifics here? All right, that gave me a chance to get some. All right, cool. I'll keep on going here. So I'll talk about Timothy. You want me to host and guest? Does anyone have a prep? Does anyone is anyone interested in being a host, or are you already a host? Is that anybody here?
I think we had a few that were interested within the group, but yeah, host and guest. That's roll on that.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep it more brief on the host side, and I'll focus on the guest side because more people want to be a guest right now. I'm guessing, right? Is that okay? And that's, again, the data shows that that's the case. I will say there's a huge opportunity if you have the capacity to be a host. And I'll say if you like being a guest, then consider being a host as well. And here's a reason for that as well. When I pick guests to be on my podcast, the first thing I check is, are they a podcast host or no? And the reason for that is a podcast host really pretty much gets the etiquette. And I very rarely have to be like, oh my goodness, why are you taking 4 phone calls right now? Like we're on a recording, right? And so like, you just kind of know, okay, they're going to get how it works. They get the culture that we're going for. And there's a lot of opportunity for influence gaining on that side of the mic, but it is work. And I tell people, don't start a podcast unless you're going to stick with it. Doing 5 episodes is not going to do anything for you. You've got to be able to say, I'm going to do this for 2 years and get to that 100 episode mark to really start seeing it take off. Huge commitment. I'll admit that. So on the host side of things, I'll just drive into it real quick. I won't actually get into like the how to start it because there are so many resources for that. I'll drop my favorite because they keep it updated. Give me a second here for how to actually start a podcast on the technical side. Give me a minute here. And it's actually my hosting provider. They have they update it all the time. It's just buzzsprout.com/blog/how-to-start-a-podcast. For anyone who watches, you can't see that, right? Or if you just type in how to start a podcast, I actually think it comes up first because it's so in depth with all the things that you need. So keep that in mind. If you're like, I do want to start that, I'll get into the technical side, but I'll talk into some best practices here. The first thing I tell people is you have to start with why. I'm just a firm believer in that. Everything we do, we got to start with why before we do anything. So like, why do you want to start a podcast? And your why has to go beyond getting rich, famous, or becoming some sort of influence. Because if it's that shallow, I don't say that to be rude, I find that those are the people that don't stick with it. They're like, oh yeah, I'm trying to get rich, famous, and this, and right. And if that doesn't happen fast, we typically jump to the next thing to see if we can kind of get rich quick type of thing, right? And podcasting is not that. As a matter of fact, the data shows that you are 4x more likely to succeed as an entrepreneur than you are as a podcaster. It's just what the data shows. So when people are like, I'm starting a podcast to make money, I'm like, don't go start a business because you have 4 times the opportunity to possibly succeed as a business owner than you will as a podcaster. So it has to come from a deep why that's devoted from, or it comes from a place of service, wanting to help somebody else, having a passion or purpose, a message that you know you want to get out to the world. And when you have that, you can do really well. So again, the first thing I say is start with why and really get clear on that. Once you do that, build out an avatar. So this is your ideal listener. Who's going to listen to this podcast? So you've got your why, you've got your avatar. what I've found to be true is the more narrow specific your avatar, the better. And I say that because going back to some podcasting data, the listening apps are getting so intelligent. They're able to help people find what they're looking for. And the number one way podcasts are discovered by a long shot is through organic search. So going into Apple Podcast or into Google or to Spotify and typing it in and finding what it is that you're looking for. Because of that, it makes sense now to go less broad, because these algorithms or these feeds, right, they're not going to deliver your content if they feel like it's all over the place. If you're consistently talking about something similar because you found how you serve that avatar, that's how you get fed to the top of the list. And I'll share more on that in a little bit, but I think that that's the biggest breakthrough in podcasting in the last couple of years. And it is the number one way people discover it. Interestingly enough, a lot of people think you have to have like all the social platforms to do well in podcasting. I have a friend who I convinced her to shut down all of her social media. She wanted to grow her podcast. She hates social media. She was on all of it, developing really great content. I challenged her at the beginning of this year to shut down all of her social media accounts. She turned them all off. And in 4 years, she got 10,000 people to listen to her podcast. And this year alone, by shutting down all of her social media and not doing it all anymore, she went from 10,000 to 65,000 last time I talked to her, and that was a month ago. And the reason is people who play on social media and people who listen to podcasts are not the same people. Interestingly enough, if you look at the analytics, you can go to Edison Research for this, is the way I'd recommend. The smartest people on the planet listen to podcasts. And we all play on social media, but it typically is people spending all their time on there are not looking to learn, they're looking to be entertained. So if you're trying to say, hey, there's a funny cat video, but first go listen to this hour-long episode with me, you're going to lose every single time. And so all she did instead of post on social media was add value to her existing list and make her content really good and guest on podcast. And she went from 10,000 in 4 years to gaining 55 additional thousand people listening to her podcast in 9 months. And that's huge. So again, we don't have to have social media to do this, but again, she's gotten really good at making sure she's covering that one niche. To give you an example of this, I have a friend who helps another friend start a podcast, and she went from 0 to 100,000 people listening almost overnight. And I was like, how? What is her podcast about? Get this. It's about grooming your golden doodle. That is the only thing she talks about. And everyone's like, that's way too niche. It'll never do good. She's in the top 0.001% of all podcasts, because believe it or not, you're in the top 1% of 5,000 people listen every week. She has hundreds of thousands of people who listen every week. And guess what? She's the only podcast about that. And I didn't know this, but golden doodle owners or parents, whatever you want to call them, these pet parents, they are rich and they are passionate, because these dogs are extremely expensive and they love their dogs more than they love their humans. So they listen and they buy everything she says. So she went from, I believe she's a millionaire now, just from a podcast. And it took her like 3 months to do it, because she didn't fall into the trap of, I want it to be for more people, so more people listen. The more narrow you get with that avatar, the better your show is going to do, because again, the discoverability is so easy at this point. When I'm a guest on podcasts, I say the same thing. People are like, can we get into your story, then your business and this? I say, no, we can get into one of those things. We're going to drive really deep into that. And that's all we're going to talk about. I don't want to share my story because that's broad. We'll share the one thing that you want to cover. We'll make the title that, we'll make the description that, and it'll become your most popular episode of all time. And every time someone takes that advice, guess what? I get emails every week. People are like, this is the single most popular podcast episode I've ever released, because it's just so niche. And I always tell people, when you think you figure out a niche, see what you can do to cut your audience in half, right? It was about marriage. Make it about marriage for people that are 25 to 28. Okay. Now it's only marriages that happen that way in this one state, in this one city, in this one place. Okay, here's the thing. If I made a city, here's a great example. If I made a podcast for my city, Jacksonville, Florida, and everyone in Jacksonville, Florida listened to it, or let's just say even 10% of the city, I'd have a top 0.001% podcast just by doing that. Right. Anyway, Timothy, you raised your hand. Sorry, I kind of went on a little rant there. Do you have something you want to add?
Yeah,
there?
just real quick, your friend that you talked out of social media and they gained all the followings. What was her podcast about?
Her podcast is for new moms that are struggling with anger issues. So like them having a kid has made them like a little bit more like bitter toward their husband, who's not around a lot, who's trying to work because now there's more to happen, right? And then she sells her coaching practice, which is for women with anger issues that just had their first kid. Crushes it. I think that's a pretty good niche to me. I'm like, that's pretty narrow. That's good. And she does well. I actually think she actually changed it to be for specifically Christian women that are in that space. So she narrowed it down again, and it's her full-time job. It's what she does full-time and absolutely just crushes it. So that was her focus. Again, figure out who it is that you serve.
Wow.
It's got tied to your why. make the avatar, narrow it down. When you can do these things before you launch, you're going to do really well. And the last thing I'll share here is to get what I just call like your top 8, right? So this is your podcast cover art. So like the little emblem you see, right? It's best if you can put 3 or 4 words on it. I mean, having your name is great, but if you like, I don't put my name on any of my stuff because no one knows how to. Apparently, Timothy knows how to pronounce my last name. Most people, good job, Timothy. Most people have no clue how to say my last name, much less can they spell it. So saying Alex Sanfilippo on my podcast makes no sense because nobody cares. I'm not famous, I'm not popular, right? And that's okay. But everyone knows, like, my podcast is called Podcasting Made Simple. Those 3 words, really big, are very catchy when you're scrolling through a feed of podcasts where it's like, I can't read any of this because they have a paragraph on there, right? So getting your cover art right is extremely important. Beyond that, your show title and your show description, super important things to have done right if you're going to do this. Again, people are always like, Alex, what's the best title for my podcast? And I always say one thing. It's the title that you don't have to explain. That's the best one. Here's an example. I live in Jacksonville, Florida. Let's say I want to start an amateur surfer podcast for entrepreneurs. All right. Amateur surfer podcast for entrepreneurs. If I call it Alex 2.0, and there's another podcast here called Amateur Surfers in Jacksonville, Florida, and you're in Jacksonville, Florida, and you're looking for that podcast, and those 2 options come up, which one are you going to click? You're going to click on the one that says Amateur Surfers in Jacksonville, Florida, every single time. Now, here's the thing. Without clicking on Alex 2.0, you don't know that mine's a better show, but you don't care because it didn't resonate with you. Alex 2.0 means nothing to anybody, right? So I tell people, stop with the clever names. And I get some of us have cool last names to kind of add fun stuff to, but people don't know what it means. You do, but they don't. So just tell them, hey, here's what I have for you by putting it in the title, and then the description should be short and just reinforce that. You can add more things in there, but your opening paragraph or a couple first few words need to just reinforce that, yes, this is what you're looking for. Those are kind of my really important things. And then the next thing is how often you release an episode. If it's heavy stuff and people are going to listen to it 2-3 times, don't release an episode every day. People are going to fall behind. Or if it's really short and really light, just some daily motivation. Maybe it's a daily show where it's 30 seconds. I have a friend who releases 30-second episodes every day, and he does very well because that's all it is. It's just one thought that he had. He shares it real quick, and then he's done. And I think that's a really unique format. So again, those are kind of like the top 4 for the show. And then the episode side, same thing. The episode title, description, the individual artwork for the episode, because you can change it for each episode. If you have guests, I always recommend putting their picture because when people are scrolling through it, they might catch their eye. People stop scrolling when they see people. And the last thing is the actual duration of the episode. How long is it going to be? So a lot of people don't look at this data, and I think it's the single most important thing to look as a podcaster. So this is like a pro tip here. If you log into your hosting provider dashboard, you can see all the analytics of who's listening. It'll tell you if Apple or Spotify is where most of your listenership comes from. And they really own the market. I mean, if you add the thousands of places after those 2 combined, they don't equal what those 2 equal each individually, right? So you want to figure out which one has more. You go to it, you log in, you look at average consumption rate per episode. Here's what I did. I had a podcast that was 55 minutes long at one point. And I realized when I did that people were dropping off pretty consistently at 70%. And so the first thing I did is I looked at the 70% mark. I'm like, do I have an ad in there? Do I have something they don't like? Do I change segments? No, there was no rhyme or reason for it other than the fact that they were telling me without telling me that it's just too long. I moved my episodes from 55 minutes down to 35 minutes and people got through 99% of it. And that to me was a huge win. I'm like, okay, now I am reaching my audience properly. They want 1 episode a week. They want it to be under 35 minutes because they're going to listen to the whole thing, which means it's good. And if it's good like that, they may actually share it. And that's ultimately what you want. So that's kind of like, again, both sides of the coin here. The episode titles themselves, make it what it is. A lot of people put, they put like, I had somebody recently, it's literally spelled it the word episode 50, season 4, and then just had the guest name. And it's just like, man, no one knows what that is. Like, we don't, first off, as a listener, and no offense to us podcasters, I like having my episodes. I don't put them in the title anymore, but I like it. But a listener doesn't care what episode it is. It'd be like watching your favorite TV show and then starting off by like, this is season 4, episode 5. Nope. You're like, cool. Show me what I'm here to watch. Right. Like, I don't care what episode and season it is. Just show it to me. So you want to just get straight to it. And I always tell people, make it compelling, make it interesting. So someone, again, they found your podcast. Now using that surfer example, how to wax your board properly so your skin doesn't rip off, right? Like, if I'm a surfer, which by the way, I'm not, but that was what made me not interested in it. I'm like, this freaking hurts, like, what is this? I would click on that episode as an amateur surfer. That would be one that's interesting. But if it said episode 4, season 5, a conversation with Alex, I'd be like, I don't know what this is. So again, we want to just get that way. I know that this isn't a room of podcasters yet, but if you just do these things, I'm telling you, it won't take you 100 episodes to get really popular. You can do it in probably 30. So 30 weeks instead of 100 weeks. Let's put it that way. If you're going to do like a weekly show, I'm telling you, there's people I know that have been podcasting for 10 years that still don't have any traction because they don't do these things. Their podcast is like a variation of their last name and their favorite color. And their episodes are sometimes just blank. Couldn't think of it. Here it is, right? You don't get traction automatically. You have to do the work. It takes 100 episodes because people can't figure it out before then usually. But right now, I'm just told you how to do it in probably 30 episodes and you can crush it. So that's the podcast side. Does anyone have any questions on that before I flip to the guest side? And sorry if I was harsh about anything. I try to be as nice as I can. Sometimes I come across as rude, I think, and I don't mean to.
Do you recommend using professional equipment or minimal types of equipment to start a podcast?
Yeah. Hold on. My mic just cut out for a second. I don't know what that was.
Speaking about minimal.
Can you also, yeah, we're talking about gear. My gear's like, no. I think it makes a big, I'm glad you brought that up. It makes a huge difference if you do have a microphone and a camera. So my suggestion there is, this is my forever gear, and I'm using 2 things that use USB. This is a USB mic, and that is a USB 4K webcam. You can find things like this where you don't spend, I think I spent $400, maybe $300 between both of them. It wasn't like anything crazy. And here's the other thing. I have sold all my old gear, and on some of it I actually made money. So keep that in mind, that it's not like necessarily you're going to be stuck with it forever. It's actually extremely easy to sell, and I had no idea. But if there's great mics. And so what I do suggest though is invest in something beyond just the mic on the computer, because it'll really separate you from the average. And if you're gonna do video, like again, YouTube becoming more and more important, right? If you want to have that element of it, then make sure you invest in something. It doesn't require a lot. Some simple Google searching and things like that will show you this, or Amazon. I can share some of my favorites, some recent ones. I just recommended a mic to someone, I think it was like $60, and it's as good as this $250 Shure mic. So, and it was, I heard somebody with the other day, I'm like, I think your mic sounds better than mine. And it's a $50 mic. Like, it's crazy. So the tech is getting really good. But yes, I do recommend, Timothy, at the very least, making a minor investment that again, you can probably get back if you decide to sell it, but it does make you really stand apart from others.
What about a recording software? So I know that I've appeared in podcasts and I'm like, jump onto this, jump onto that. I've got a mini recording studios. Confuses me a little bit, but
yeah, I like rolling out what I call the red carpet. So I use riverside.fm. Yeah, riverside.fm. I like that one a lot for remote recording. It makes it easy. And what I like about it is like Zoom started doing this as well. You can use Zoom. I just find that if you want like 4K, you want like the highest quality audio and then all being separate files and tracks and the ability to do some minor editing inside of it, something like riverside.fm goes a long way. I'm a paying customer myself, not like affiliated with them. I really like it a lot. I use that for all my recordings.
I just have a quick question. Huh, that's strange.
I heard you twice, but go ahead.
I know. Question in regards to, where do you search for names? How do you know if a name has been taken? Is it just a Google search, or is there a website that?
Yeah, I just go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify. They're the 2 big ones, and just see if it's there. And it may be. The other thing is, if it hasn't been active in 10 years, it's probably okay, unless it's a big, like if you took Serial, you're going to get a phone call. That being like one of the most popular podcasts of all time that hasn't been around for a while. But yeah, just do a little bit of searching. And typically if you add just a word to it or something like that, then it helps. To find out if the name is searchable, by the way, I do use Google. I just look at the auto suggest to see what fills in. So if I type in like surfing Jacksonville, Florida, it'll come up with a different question, which might be how to start surfing in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm like, okay, maybe how to start surfing in Jacksonville, Florida would be a great name for a podcast. And that's probably not a good example, but yeah, that's what I look at. And again, there's not that many podcasts out there. So really, I don't think most names would be taken.
I have a question that seems really simple to me, but I don't understand the avatar aspect. You mean just like the little cartoon picture that we pick out?
No, good point. Sorry, your ideal listener is another way to describe that. So you're just writing down who that person is. I'm glad you asked that, Margie. That's really important. So for me, like my avatar or ideal listener is the person that I'm making all of my content for. I'm glad you asked me to clarify. I don't think I did a good job with that. So what I used to have it right here on the side of my screen and put it there. His name's Adam. I can tell you how old Adam is, where he lives, where he's at in life, and what it is that he's looking for out of a show like mine. And then I just run everything through that. So like when someone pitches and like, hey, I want to be a guest to talk about this, the first question I would say, because my avatar's name is Adam, I'd be like, would Adam get value from this? If yes, continue. If no, then stop. It made my job really easy because most of the time I'm just like, this is an absolute no. Adam does not care about this, right? So yeah, again, it's your ideal listener, not actually anything to do with you. But I'm glad you asked me to clarify that. Thank you. Like I said, I started using some inside lingo. Thank you for the help, Margie. I appreciate it. All right, on to guesting, or does anyone have okay, cool. The guesting side of the mic. So starting off like where we left off, same thing, a little bit of investment goes a long way. Hosts like guests that they don't have to worry about before they record. I have someone I know, and he had a guest on that he was super nervous about, and he didn't vet them. And the day of, the person was on a walk talking through their cell phone, no earbuds or anything, just holding it in front of them. And he said it was just a terrible interview because they kept on like, you couldn't hear them over cars going by. But here's the thing, like that person just didn't know. And he said it was actually a good conversation. He's like, I just wish that there was something I could actually share aside from the audio, which by the way, sounds awful, right? Because he was like on mics and stuff like that, and the other person wasn't. So it goes a long way if you show you're the guest that has put a little bit of effort in. Now you really can get away with just putting in like Apple or anything. Like I always look at the white ones though, like the little white earbuds with the little hanging thing, right? And you plug that in, use like a MacBook type of thing, like that does work. You can do that. But again, long-term, I'd suggest making it at least a small investment to show that, hey, I've got the gear, I've got it set up, I've got my lighting pretty good. All that stuff goes a long way for a podcast host because they like to be able to share the assets in different ways. And the assets are, you know what Margie said in this little clip, like 30 seconds, Margie said, just pure gold. I want to be able to turn that into a video and share that on shorts and here, right? Like, and a lot of hosts like to do that. And if they have good social traction, that'll work well for them. But what doesn't work is if the guest is in a dark room or walking on the side of the road, right? Then it's like, okay, I can't really share this. So now we just have to rely on my ability to do all the things Alex just talked about as the host correctly. So you can make a host job much easier if you have the right setup. Beyond that, so now that kind of out of the way, the gear, and you don't need things like Riverside. If you're the guest, the host will have all that. You're joining the host's room, so there's no investment needed on that side, aside from the gear itself. To be a good guest, though, I always suggest starting off with building some sort of media one sheet, which are becoming very popular these days. I'll drop mine in the chat here. If you go to and if anyone who's watching replay, if you go to alexsanfilippo.com, there's a button on there that says have Alex as a guest on your podcast. And this right here is my media one sheet. And I built it through full disclaimer here. I built it through Podmatch, which is a company that I own. It's a software that connects guests and hosts together for interviews. I always say it works just like a dating app, but instead of connecting you for dates, it connects you for podcast interviews, is the way I like to say it. But anyway, the point here is this is like my media one sheet, and it's just got some of the key things on it. So if I'm a host looking for a guest and you show me that you have some page I can go to with approved pictures that I can use, approved bio that I can use, what you're going to want your call to action to be, some questions you're ready to answer, ideas for topics, all your links. I think that just goes such a long way. For me, it does at least. I mean, it really like makes a huge difference. Like, oh, I don't have to do all the work. I'm still going to do my research and do my work, but I don't have to. Anyway, so I think that what really matters is you setting up something like this. Doesn't need to be on Podmatch. Use it somewhere else, wherever it is that you see fit, but have something. And keep in mind, a host, if you have a bio, that's what they're going to read. If you don't have a bio, they're going to say what they think they could find. And if you don't direct how you want them to do that, they might bring up something from 15 years ago that you're like, oh, I don't really want to talk about that. Not that it's like a bad thing, but you're like, here's the example myself. Before I had this, I'd go on podcasts and everyone would bring up my aerospace career because it was 15 years of my life. I didn't want to talk about that anymore. I was moved on from that, right? I'll talk about some of the things I learned, but I don't want that to be my bio. Alex has done 15 years in the aerospace industry. I'm like, hold on, I'm not doing that anymore. But if you don't set that expectation, they're going to go find this stuff on their own. So a media one sheet basically says, hey, in this context, do your own research, but they're probably going to not veer off too far from it and talk to you about something that you don't have. So having something like that, again, super, super helpful to make sure you have some sort of media one sheet where you're figuring out what it is that you want to talk about. Just like the host, have a why, have an avatar or an ideal listener in mind. Who is it that you're going to serve? Knowing this stuff up front and then directing everything to that is what makes the biggest difference as a podcast guest. First thing, I can be on any show about anything. Same thing. Before you go on a show, you want to be like, is this going to add value to, in my case, Adam? In your case, whatever you decide to call your ideal listener, right? Who is it that I'm showing up to serve? How can I serve them? And then you know what you can and can't do as far as guesting is concerned. So I did see, sorry, we had like a link in here. I'm going to click on this real quick. Speaker page. This is great. Yes, this is really good. You have some sample questions. You have the relationship coach, which is really like, that's your bio right there. Great picture, by the way. I like that a lot. Looks good. Yeah, this is good. I think you have a lot of it here. Sample questions, what your audience. Yeah, cool. This is good. I like you. You're way ahead of it. Look at that. That's the type of thing you want right there. If you send that to somebody, they now know the context in which you want them to talk about. And you have the sample questions. I have met very few hosts that ever use those questions, but they're going to make sure that it fits in that. They're going to put it in their own words, which is the beauty of it, right? Because it's not taking off track of where you want it to go. So again, really important thing, get the right gear. Beyond that, make sure you have some sort of media one sheet. And again, know who it is that you're going to serve. What does the listener have in their mind that they're looking for? What is it they're listening to that podcast for? What is it that they can learn? I always suggest listening to a podcast before you go on it. I have a horror story about this. I had somebody who's like, hey, I want you on my podcast. This is before I had Podmatch. I was like, sure, I'll come on. What do you want to talk about? He's like, I want to talk about your business. Or he said, I want to get into your business. I was like, perfect. I love just starting a company. This sounds great. When he said get into your business, he meant the business of Alex Sanfilippo. Dr. Paula, apparently you knew that. I needed you to tell me don't do this. His very first question, hey, Alex, thanks for coming on today. Do you hold yourself responsible for your parents' divorce? I was like, whoa. I'm like, it was like a year. It was like just happened a year before that. I was like, is this where this is going to go? It was done live, which I didn't know was live either because I didn't do any research. So it was live. There was an audience there. And this dude just, every question was to try to make me mad, was to try to get under my skin. I don't know what he was going for. I didn't have, again, no celebrity behind my name. There was no benefit in this. It's just the way he liked to, quote unquote, interview people. It's more like interrogate, I think. But anyway, if I would have just listened to one episode for 2 minutes, I would have known that this is not the right show for me. It ended up being a fine conversation, but in general, at the end of it, I was like stressed out. I'm like, why did I just do that? I put myself in pain by my own accord, right? So I always tell people, go listen to the podcast before you're a guest on it, because also not only will it save you from that, but it'll also teach you how you should show up. Here's an example. Recently, I was on a podcast, and the host talks real slow. And she just kind of likes to keep the conversation going and let's breathe. And this is what and here's the thing. That's what her audience likes. If I would have showed them like, whoa, let's go, everybody. So glad to be here. That tone would be so out of balance that the listeners that listen because they like her calm demeanor would have been like, who is this crazy person you brought on? Right. So I didn't pretend to be somebody I wasn't. I just slowed down a little bit, had the conversation. It was more relaxed. Listening, I think, is the biggest, that'll differentiate you from another podcast guest tenfold, because most people don't listen. Sometimes they don't even know the name of the podcast or the name of the host, right? It's just like, yeah, I'll do it. Give me more reps, right? And it's better to build a relationship and to do it that way. So I always suggest listening. Again, while you're listening, think about it. Is my avatar here? Is my ideal listener listening to this podcast? If yes, let's keep it going. And so you always want to think about that. And I always say it's quality over quantity, because if you do such a good job, people are going to share it. Here's an example. I've never listened to Ed Millett's podcast before 4 days ago. Somebody suggested it to me because they said the episode was so good. So he didn't ask anyone to share it. A buddy of mine shared it. He's like, dude, the guest is Rob Dyrdek. I was like, the skateboarder? And he's like, yeah. He's like, dude, it's so good. I'm like, it's not going to be good, bro. I'm like, no offense. I'm like, but he's a skateboard punk. Like, it's not going to be good. And he's like, dude, I promise, just listen to the first 3 minutes. You're going to love it. I listened to the full hour of it and shared it with, like, I can't even tell you people I've shared it with in the last hour. It's because it was the single best content I've ever heard on intentionally living your life. Nothing but respect for the guy now. I thought he was a skateboard punk. Turns out he's like from a different planet. But it was so good. So I always tell people, like, stop trying to get on 100 podcasts this week. Get on one and do such a good job that everyone who listens to it tells everyone in their life, I'm not friends with you anymore if you don't listen to this right now. Right. I had somebody recently do that to my podcast, on my podcast. He listened to it, and it wasn't me, it was the guest. Did such a good job. He told everyone, he's a very successful coach. He told every single one of his clients, I will fire you if you don't listen to this podcast episode this week. And he texts me later. And he goes, "Hey man, I lost most of my friends and family because I told them if they don't listen to this, then I don't want to ever talk to them again." He's like, "This was the single best podcast I've ever heard in my life." He's like, "I listened to it 6 times a day on average." Here's the thing. If you're that guest, you only need to be a guest on one show ever, because now that show is extremely successful because everyone who hears it feels compelled to share it. So I always tell people, stop trying to be on the thousands and hundreds of shows and the biggest one. Go and do such a good job. Be the best at what you are and really speak to the right person only you can speak to. And I'm telling you, the world's there. It's going to go viral, lack of a better term, right? Timothy, what do you got on that?
My question is, I hear a lot from people that appear on a lot of podcasts, and they're kind of like, I'm sick of saying the same things and again and over and over. What's your suggestion to diversify and to branch out into different subject matter, yet still talk about your main thing?
That's good. It goes back to like the niche that we talked about as a host, as a guest. Change your media one sheet up. So this week, if it like Dr. Paula, if it's about relationships, like this week or this month, right, you can get on 2 podcasts about relationships from this perspective, and then change it. And that way you're not getting the same questions. But a lot of us, we kind of set it and forget it because we go a little bit more broad in general. But the more narrow specific you get, the better the questions will be on that. And then just change it when you're like, cool, I've done enough of these. Let me shift this a little bit. And I'm not talking about like relationships this week and surfing next week, right? Like I'm just talking about like, okay, relationships. I don't really know what you fully what you do, Dr. Paula, so forgive me if I'm saying it wrong, but like relationships and marriage, relationships with your kids, right? And like just kind of shift that a little bit so you can kind of share some different content over time versus just relationships. Let's go. It's like, nope, only marriage, right? And then only like a parent and their kid, right? However that goes. Anyway, so that's kind of my perspective on that, Timothy. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Beyond, let's see, I'm trying to think of what else is important. Okay. If we want to get into pitching, because I think that that's really important. If you've kind of like heard everything I've said here, like, okay, how do I get on shows? You've got to be good at a pitch these days. And that's just the reality of, again, like at the beginning, I told you how there's like 17 people to every one podcast trying to be a guest right now. Podcast hosts have options. When I started my podcast, I couldn't convince people to be on the show. Like people were like, why on earth would I want to be on a podcast? It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And this wasn't even that long ago. I'm talking like 6 years ago. People were like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'm not going to waste my time. And now I have those same people and all their friends and everyone who's ever met them saying, please, 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 please let me on your podcast. I'll do anything, right? I'll do anything to be on your show. I always make the joke, Taylor Swift tries to be on my show. And I'm like, what's your value prop? What makes you different? Why are you unique? Why should I let you on the show, right? That's obviously an extreme example. But in general, it turns into like, why should you be the one to be on there? And so what I'll share is how I pitch to be a guest on podcast to let you know how competitive this is getting. And I'm going to drop it in the chat because there's 5 things I'm going to share that way, just everyone can see it once I'm done talking about it. This used to have a 97% success rate. So 97% of the podcasts I'd pitch to, I'd be a guest on. The caveat there is that I only pitch podcasts where I was a good fit. So it wasn't just me spraying and praying. It was like, no, I'm the best fit in the world for this, right? Fast forward years, I only have about a 60% success rate because there are 40% of people that are much better at this topic I'm talking about than I am at it, and they're more qualified than I am. So now even that is getting competitive, but I still think 60% is pretty good. So I'll share this is how I get to be a guest on podcasts. The first thing I do is I lead with value when I'm reaching out. And I typically try to find their email address or whatever their preferred method is. So like if I see that I use Podmatch mostly, that makes it really easy. I'm not trying to pitch that, but it's easy. That's people that are there want guests for their show, and they're wanting people to reach out who want to be a guest. So that makes it really easy. Beyond that, if they have their email address or they have some sort of form on their website, I'll go find that. Or if it's like, okay, they don't have any of that, but they're super active on Twitter. I'm not going to go to their Instagram where they haven't posted in 5 years. I'm going to go to Twitter. I'm going to send them a message there, right? So I'm going to meet them where they are. And the first thing I always do is lead with value. So lead with value, step 1. What lead with value means is listen to the podcast, mention what you liked about the podcast. And if you really want the bonus points, attach a screenshot of you leaving a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So your actual review. So for me, I'll be like, this is how I would do this. I'd be like, hey, Timothy, just listen to your podcast. Really enjoyed your latest episode with so-and-so. Here's what I took away from it. I liked it so much. I left you a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcast. I attached that for you. Here's the thing. If you do that, the very least, you now have that host's attention versus the typical, which is, hi, I want to be a guest on your podcast. You're like, yeah, so does everyone else. Like, stop, leave me alone, please. Right. But if you start off with that, you're going to do better. I have had in 10 or 12 years of podcasting. I don't even know how, 10 years probably, maybe longer. I don't know. I've been podcasting a long time. I've had 2 people do that. Both of them were a guest on my podcast. On average, I have 30 to 40 or 50 people reach out every week to be a guest on my podcast. I only need 1 a week, right? So, and all of them are pretty much the same. Hi, I'm so-and-so. I've done this, and I want to be a guest on your podcast, right? And so it's just like, man, that does not stand out anymore. But if you lead with value, you show me that you actually listened and you prove it, right? That goes a long way. The second thing I do is I make a meaningful request. I get pitches sometimes it's the length of a book and there's no ask in it. So I'm like reading, I'm a podcaster, so I don't want to read, like I'll read books, but I don't want to read an email that's the length of a book. And there's no ask. So someone's like, what does this person want from me? Like, I don't even understand what it is. They've told me everything about themselves since they were a kid. Like, no offense, I don't know you, I don't care, right? And that sounds so rude. But if you make a meaningful request, a host can see that and make it stand out. So again, going with this framework I'm sharing, loved your podcast, Timothy. That was really great how you kind of dove into this conversation. Here's the Apple rating and review. Hey, I realized in the last year, I looked through all your episodes, you have not covered the topic of how to be a better guest on podcast. I would love the opportunity to be that guest. That's really what I focus on. Now, again, the host is going to say, have I not covered that? Really? They're going to scroll through themselves and be like, shoot, I haven't covered that topic. I didn't even realize. Almost every time, that's the response I get. I didn't even realize we hadn't talked about that. What an important topic, right? And it has to actually be an important topic. If Timothy's podcast is about how to like release a book, right? And I'm like, hey, you haven't talked about grooming your golden doodle in the last year. He's gonna be like, well, obviously, I've never talked about that. Forgive me if you're a golden doodle owner, Timothy. Nope. Okay, cool. So we're good. But make that meaningful request. The next thing you want to do is offer credibility. So step 3 is offer credibility. And most of us get this wrong. We think of credibility like a resume where you need to share what you've done and accomplished. Those are great things to link out to. So again, talking about having that media one sheet earlier, link to your media one sheet. But as far as offering credibility is concerned, look to see who you know that they know as well. Look through their past guests, look who you're mutual friends with on social media. And here's how I do that. Basically, my way of doing credibility is like, hey, Timothy, I noticed that we're both friends with Dr. Paula. She's been on my podcast, or I've been on her, whatever it is, right? And basically being like, ask her if I'm legit or not, and please let me know because I pay her to say nice things about me. So I don't want to pay her if she's not saying nice things about me anymore, right? I typically drop my humor in there, and then I say, if you want to learn more about what I like, my actual experience in this, here's a link for that. Keep it really short. Here's the thing: I always say no to podcasts. But this was actually the flip, kind of the same though. Somebody asked me to be a guest on their podcast that has not launched. I know that something like 95% of podcasts that plan on launching never launch. So I always say no. I say, hit me up when you need a guest for your 100th episode. I don't want to be on it now, right? But I had somebody a couple months ago hit me up. She's like, I haven't launched my podcast. And I was immediately like, red flag, I'm going to say no. And she said, just want to let you know, some of your mutual friends have already been on it. She named 4 people. I didn't even read the rest of the email. I just literally responded, I love those people. Tell me when and where to be, like when and where to be. And I'm there. I'll do anything. I'll be as long as you want. If those 4 people are part of it, I'm part of it, right? They did the work for me by getting that credibility. And that's what you're going for as a guest. If you can build that, it goes so much further than your credentials. You can link to those, but make sure when you're offering credibility, you're mentioning something that you have in common. All right. Number 4 is to mention that you'll share the episode. Please do not lie. Have integrity. If you're not willing to share it, don't say this, skip this one. But if you are willing to share it, mention it. Because I'll tell you what, it's almost, I don't know the actual data. Only a handful of guests have ever shared a podcast episode. Let's put it that way. It's extremely, extremely rare. It is the number 1 complaint from podcasters. The guest says, yeah, I'll definitely share it. For sure. For sure. Comes time to share it. And they never respond to anything ever again. They're done. They like block their email. They don't want to hear it. Right. Just, I was a guest on your podcast. Check, leave me alone, please. It's typically how it goes. And if you mention that you'll share it and you mean it, that goes a long way. So for me, I say, hey, anything you post about our episode together, I'm going to reshare it. And I'm also going to link to your podcast episode from my website so that everyone who comes on my website can also find it. And I actually do that every single time, except for the one time the guy got into my business, as I mentioned earlier. Didn't link to that one. I was terrified of that. Past that, I've done it every time. And again, if you're not willing to do that and it doesn't fit your model, just skip that part. And the last thing is to make it easy to say no. To make it easy to say no. You want to open a dialogue with this person. You don't want it to feel like you either have to say yes or this is just done, right? And the way I do this, I just say, hey, no worries either way. I only want to be a guest if I'm truly the right fit, but I'd love to hear back from you either way. And that always opens the dialogue. And what I found is typically no means not right now. It doesn't actually mean no forever. It means not right now, maybe later. And so by opening up that dialogue, give them permission to not break my heart, but respond, they typically do. And sometimes, like I said, it only works 60% of the time. It works every time, right? The 40%, they still are responding saying, hey, thank you so much. It's really not the right fit, but I do appreciate you. And I say, great, love to stay in touch. I'm going to listen to your podcast in a few months. I'd love to circle back with you if that's cool, just to see how you're doing. And I start building that relationship. But typically that 60% turns into an 80 because a couple months later, people are like, you know what? Let's do this. Like you're actually following up with me. You listen to another episode. Come on, let's do it. So those are my 5 steps that I do. And it's worked well for me to get on podcast. And anyone have any questions on that? Because I have one more thing I want to cover, then I'll be done. Cool. No questions. Hopefully it's clear and not. Yeah, okay, cool. Everyone's nodding. Thank you. You are awesome. This is a great group, Timothy. You got some cool people here. The last thing I'll share is your call to action. So your call to action. And so again, your bio, a host is typically going to read that. They're going to ask you the questions that they find through your one-sheeter that you kind of direct. And at the end, they're going to say, where can listeners find out more about you? Something along those lines. It always happens. The most important thing is to have one singular call to action. One singular call to action. And here's why I say that. Podcast listeners are typically driving, cleaning, cooking, working out, on a walk, doing something other than just sitting there and taking notes, right? So you need to be able to give them something they can remember without feeling like it's going to cause fatigue. And what happens at the end of an episode, let's imagine their phone sitting down, it just rolls in the next one. So if you say, I've got a website, I've got a phone number, I've got YouTube, I've got social media, I dance on TikTok all the time, I've got this, and there's a show notes page, and I got 3 books, and this. Now the person listening is like, oh my gosh, okay, ooh, new episode, because it rolls right into the next one, right? And then you're forgotten just like that. If you have something really specific, really easy to remember, a desired action that's going to continue adding value based off what you just shared, you're going to convert really well, but it has to follow that blueprint. So for me, it's funny, I only talk about podcasting on podcast of all things, right? It's really meta here, sorry. But when people are like, hey, Alex, where can they find out more about you? I say the same thing every single time. Hey, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the time today. If anyone got something out of this or they want more on this topic, if you just go to podpros.com/win, it'll give you 5 quick wins you can consume in less than 5 minutes. I don't want your email address or anything like that. It's just some tips to further your experience as a guest or host. Again, that's 5 quick wins you can experience in less than 5 minutes, podpros.com/win. And again, thank you so much for having me. Every single time, that's what I do. podpros.com/win. 5 quick wins, less than 5 minutes, no email address required. If I really was like trekking with that, I might actually be like, oh, hold on, podpros.com/win. I'll look that up, right? But if I said, or call me, or text me, or this, I just muddy the waters. So you want to get really narrow specific, make it really involved with what you just shared about. If you were talking about dog grooming the whole time, don't mention that you're also a coach, right? Unless you're like, hey, a lot of people that have these golden doodles, these dogs are annoying. They bark and it causes a lot of anxiety for their owners. I wrote this really quick guide for how to get your dog to stop barking and making you feel uncomfortable. If you want that, go to keepmydogquiet.com. Like if you do that, and I'm not a dog owner, so forgive me if that's like not a real stress point, but if it is, and someone just heard that, like, oh shoot, that's exactly what I've been needing. And it goes right along with this conversation because I now trust this person. Let me check it out. Maybe not the best example, but that's kind of like how I do call to action. And I'll be quiet now. That's all I got.
All right, so go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, Alex, I'm interested to know, why don't you want emails? You're the first person I've ever heard say that.
So if you go to podpros.com/win, it gives you those 5 quick wins that you're in less than 5 minutes. The bottom says, you want 5 more? Put in your email address here and I'll send you 5 more. I find that it's better to have your podcast as a guest or host be the introduction to the funnel, not the top of the funnel. So you want to basically continue showing them and add value and bring them through kind of that funnel. And sure enough, if you put in your email address, you're going to get 5 more quick wins like that. And then from there, it's going to introduce you to other things I do. And I don't have a high ticket product. I mean, the most you can spend with me is $54 a month at most, right? So it's like, I don't have this massive funnel, but before I even want anything from somebody, I want to show the value. The example I always give is if I'm married, I've been married a long time and I'm super happy. Let's just use a bar example though. If I go to a bar and tell a girl, I want to buy you a drink, first, what's your phone number? I'm gonna get no every time. Some people might be able to pull that off. I can't. So I'm basically like, here's a drink. And if they want another one, they're going to give me their phone number so we can go back out again, right? And that's kind of the way I've always envisioned like my top of funnel as a podcaster.
Yeah, I really understand that, because sometimes I'll go to a site and the first thing I want is their email, and I said, you know what, I just don't want to give my email to somebody else. I've given it to so many people. And so like to actually, you want something later on, like you're opting in rather than existing. If that makes sense.
That's a great way to say it. That's good. I like that. Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions for Alex? All right. Well,
I
this is,
did.
go ahead.
I had a question about the host part. I do have a YouTube channel, and I have a show, but it's like more like awareness based for every month. Like this month is a breast cancer awareness month. I would interview somebody that's a breast cancer survivor. So would a month by month show be too long in between episodes if I were to make it into a podcast?
No, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that. My first successful podcast, I'd say, I actually sold the podcast in the company and everything like that. Like, it did really well. It was a monthly podcast and it was 15 minutes. So first Monday of every month, it was a 15-minute episode. That is all I could commit to consistently. And I did that every month for 5 years or something like that. And the audience continued to grow because I set the expectation up front. So I love that you're doing it monthly. Just make that known and say, hey, I don't know, the first Tuesday of every month or the third Thursday of every month, we're going to have a new episode. As long as you set the expectation, you show up, people are okay with it. I go back to like when I was a kid and I watched TV. You all remember this, like Friday night, like sometimes these family shows come on, they're like, yes, can't wait. And sometimes you'd show up and it's a rerun of something else. And you're like, what? I got the popcorn ready. Mom and dad said I could stay up late, right? All you want to do is set that expectation. If they said it was once a month on Friday, then I wouldn't be showing up every week with popcorn. I'd show up once a month with it. So I love that you brought that up. I think it's important to stay consistent with what you know you can do and not try to push it too much. So that would be my advice to you there.
So what if if you interview somebody and it's like you said, mentioned 15 minutes. What if it's longer than 15 minutes? Is it okay to stretch that conversation between in that month, week by week?
Yeah, that's fine. 15 minutes is what worked for me and for my audience. Okay. I know people who do monthly shows that are multiple hours. I don't necessarily suggest that, but if you okay. the duration of the actual episode doesn't matter, again, as long as it's consistent. What you don't want is 1 month for it to be 15 minutes, the next month for it to be 4 hours, right? You want to try to keep it around the same. So if it's an hour to an hour and a half conversation, I think that's great. I think that's really good. And again, because it's monthly, your listeners know I can listen to this over the next week. I'm not going to fall behind by doing that. And sometimes I think that can be a little bit better for people.
Yeah. The other drawback on YouTube is what I find too is you're trapped in an algorithm, right? So if your listeners are watching a lot of comedy shows recently, your podcast or because I have a series on YouTube. The people that really want to watch it might not even show up on their page. So it's up to them to remember. You want to basically have some way that they'll remember the show's up now.
Okay, thanks. Got some things to think about.
Awesome. Great question.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So anyone else have any questions before we say goodbye to Alex, who has generously given us his time and given us a lot of great information? All right, folks. Thanks very much. Alex, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. It was really a blessing to spend time with everybody today. I appreciate all of you. And Timothy, thank you for the platform. Truly an honor. It means a lot. And
next week we have a lesson on legal things to watch for when you're writing, especially when you're writing nonfiction and memoir. So check that one out.
Nice. Good stuff.
All right.
Pat, do you have
Take care, everybody.
question? Pat, did you have a question? Somebody just came on camera, Tim.
And real quick,